The date is July 13th, 1862, in Rutherford County, Tennessee. The two commanders of the oncoming battle would be for the United States Brigadier General Thomas Turpin Crittenden and Confederate States of America Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest. Because of the events of this battle, Forrest would become a Brigadier General. But to keep things historically correct, in this video, we shall call him by his rank at the time of the battle. The units involved would be the Murfreesboro Garrison versus Forrest Cavalry Brigade. While this was a minor victory for the Confederate side of the war, this event would cause upheaval in Murfreesboro and help General Bragg to make a decision for the Confederate Heartland Offensive. Come along with us as we walk through the Confederate surprise attack on Murfreesboro, Tennessee. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Backing up to Go Forward. June 7th and 8th of 1862 was the artillery battle between Brigadier General James S. Negley and Major General Edmund Kirby Smith in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This was a Union victory. On June 10th, 1862, Union Major General Don Carlos Buell, commanding the Army of the Ohio, was making a casual advance towards Chattanooga from Corinth, Mississippi, to reinforce Negley. These actions demanded a response. The Confederate government sent Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest to Chattanooga to organize a cavalry brigade and retake the city. Together with Colonel John Hunt Morgan, the two men had a Confederate cavalry by July. According to the plan, Forrest would dispatch two of his cavalry units to retake Murfreesboro. The plan included Morgan launching a cavalry offensive against the Union stations in Kentucky. On July 9th, Forrest left Chattanooga with two cavalry regiments heading to Murfreesboro. The city of Murfreesboro was an important supply center for the Union because the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad was located there. Two more cavalry regiments joined Forrest on his journey. Forrest's total numbers would grow to about 1,400 men. The focus would be to capture the city and to destroy Union supplies. The movements of July 12, 1862. On July 12, 1862, Brigadier General Thomas Turpin Crittenden had arrived in Murfreesboro from Alabama. His first action was to take the command of the garrison from Colonel Lester of the 3rd Minnesota. The entire garrison was divided into 3 camp locations around the city and was chaotic in its leadership. Crittenden hoped that by his arriving and taking over the command of the garrison, that he would bring the men together under one cohesive unit once again. On the same day, Forrest had stopped his march and camped at McMinnville. This was 40 miles from Murfreesboro. Forrest sent out a detachment of the 8th Texas to test the Union troops in the area. They were able to capture Union pickets without a shot being fired. From these captured men, Forrest was able to learn about the uncoordinated Union placements surrounding Murfreesboro. It seems that there were problems with the leadership of the Union forces. The men were spread out over 3 locations due to the fighting of the commanders and the lack of water supplies. The 9th Michigan, along with a unit from the 4th Kentucky Cavalry, was camped at Maney Spring. The 3rd Minnesota and part of the 1st Kentucky Battery were now a mile and a half northwest of town. The 9th Michigan's Company B, commanded by Captain Oliver C. Rounds, who was also acting marshal, was holding several local citizens as prisoners at the courthouse. They were to be executed by order of Major General Thomas L. Crittenden. The two sides. First, we will look at the Union side. Now commanding the Murfreesboro Garrison was Brigadier General Thomas T. Crittenden. He would have 4 units under his command, consisting of a regiment of cavalry, 2 regiments of infantry, and a battery of artillery. They were the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment under the command of Colonel George C. Winkup, the 9th Michigan Infantry Regiment under the command of Colonel William W. Duffield, the 3rd Minnesota Infantry Regiment under the command of Colonel Henry C. Lester, and the Battery B, 1st Kentucky Light Artillery under the command of Captain John M. Hewitt. Next is the Confederate side. Colonel Bedford Forrest's Cavalry Brigade consisted of 3 cavalry units and 2 infantry battalions. They were the 8th Texas Cavalry Regiment under the command of Colonel John Wharton, the 1st Georgia Cavalry Battalion, the 2nd Georgia Cavalry Regiment under the command of Colonel William J. Lawton, and 2 battalions of Tennessee and Kentucky infantry. They would arrive in Murfreesboro just before dawn on July 13th. The attack on Woodbury Pike. At the camp located at Woodbury Pike, east of Murfreesboro, would be the garrison of the 7th Pennsylvania and 9th Michigan Infantry. These units would also be encamped in the city of Murfreesboro, but again, they were spread out because of leadership issues. Sometime on July 13th, between 4:15 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., a group of 15 cavalrymen were able to avoid the midnight patrols. They came from the east to capture the Union Hospital. They moved to surprise the Union pickets at Woodbury Pike. There was no reaction by the other Union units stationed nearby when firing began. Because of this inaction, Forrest was able to move on Murfreesboro. The attack on the city of Murfreesboro. Swiftly, the Confederate cavalry and infantry rushed upon the streets of Murfreesboro in 3 columns. The first column was under the command of Colonel John Wharton of the 8th Texas Cavalry. His column moved north to Maney Springs, where they were able to capture the men there without inflicting or taking any casualties. The second column was under the command of Forrest, who led the 1st Georgia Cavalry into Town Square and liberated the prisoners in the jail. At first, the attempts at freeing the prisoners were not successful, as there was a sharpshooter that was situated in the cupola. The door of the courthouse was finally breached, and a fire kindled in the building. The guards inside had to surrender so that they could put out the flames. The third column consisted of Colonel William Lawton's 2nd Georgia Cavalry, who went north to Lebanon Pike. Their job was to cut off any means of escape for the 9th Michigan. Confederate cavalrymen were able to find Brigadier General Crittenden asleep, so they woke him up and captured him. The next person with the highest rank on the Union side who had not been captured yet in Murfreesboro was Colonel Duffield. Duffield ordered Lieutenant Colonel Parkhurst to form what was left of the 9th Michigan to engage the enemy cavalry as more of them were approaching the city. Duffield then ordered the men into the square. This was an impossible task, as the square had been taken by the Confederate cavalry. Instead, Walton's Texans attacked the 9th, compelling them to withdraw to the fence line in front of the Maney House. There, the 9th would hold this position against several attacks. There is a report that Colonel William Duffield was wounded and taken into the Maney House at Oaklands. Attack on the 3rd Minnesota. Hearing the firing and commotion that was going on in the city of Murfreesboro, Colonel Lester gathered his 3rd Minnesota Infantry Regiment. Then, Lester formed a line alongside of Captain Hewitt's battery on a high ridge in front of Murphy House, northwest of town. The Confederate 2nd Georgia Cavalry advanced a quarter of a mile to the timber front. There, they engaged the line at the high ridge. Hewitt's battery fired artillery that crashed into the woods as both sides exchanged fire in skirmishes. The 3rd Minnesota skirmishers fell back in line with the rest of their regiment as the 2nd Georgia charged. But this was quickly halted as they faced the full fire of the regiment. The men of the 2nd Georgia quickly found places for cover. Then both sides began exchanging shots once again. Confederate Colonel Lawton was impressed by the sharpshooters of the 3rd Minnesota. He would later report that, quote, the enemy's sharpshooters were quite effective, unquote. Seeing how the 2nd Georgia Regiment was having a hard time breaking the line of the Union forces, Forrest gathered 200 of his men to attack the 3rd camp. The 3rd camp was now being guarded by 30 men under the command of Chaplain Charles H. Greene of Company I. This would not be an easy task, as the first 2 attacks on this camp were denied. It took the 3rd try to overrun the camp. During this time, Colonel Lester was engaged and was not able to send infantry or artillery support. There are reports that he was not engaged in the fighting and refused to send the needed help regardless of their dire situation. However, he did send out scouts to the camp of the 9th Michigan. Unable to get through because of Colonel William J. Lawton's 2nd Georgia Cavalry Regiment, they were able to send messages back to Lester. The first message said that the 9th Michigan was surrounded and needed relief. The second message relayed that the blocking forces were too large for the 3rd to break through their line. The Union side was able to hold off all Confederate efforts and hold their ground until late that afternoon. Finally, the 3rd Minnesota and 9th Michigan surrendered to Forrest. Because of Lester overestimating the forces against him, when Forrest received the surrender of the other units, Lester also surrendered. Lester's actions or inaction during this part of the battle would lead to his court-martial for cowardice. After the battle. The First Battle of Murfreesboro was not without destruction and carnage. The Union would report a loss of 15 men killed, 86 men wounded, and 713 to 1,200 men captured, depending upon the sources used. Among the captured number was Major General Crittenden and Captain Rounds. The Confederate side would report a loss of 25 men killed and 40 to 125 men wounded, again depending upon the sources used. A great deal of the Union supplies would be captured or destroyed when the Confederates took control of the rail depot. The damage to the railroad would include a track for the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, which would be torn up, and a bridge south of town that would be burned down. There would be a huge amount of other Union supplies that would be captured, including the 4 pieces of artillery, which was valued at around $250,000. There would be fire damage to the courthouse. Condemned citizens in the courthouse had been set free. Because of the large number of captives, Forrest had to leave McMinnville. Murfreesboro was once again free for Federal occupation. The result of the raid, the First Battle of Murfreesboro, would be considered a diversion tactic to distract the Union forces who were advancing upon Chattanooga. This raid did divert troops from Chattanooga and did disrupt the Union control over Middle Tennessee. It also destroyed communications and stores in Murfreesboro. Because of the overestimation that Forrest had 3,500 troops instead of 1,400 troops, local garrisons were called from the Army of Ohio to protect Nashville and Middle Tennessee. The first battle for Murfreesboro, along with Morgan's raid into Kentucky, would make it possible for the Confederate Heartland Offensive to take shape. Also, because of the success of his first independent raid, Forrest's reputation gained in popularity, and he received a promotion to Brigadier General. The next action to take place at Murfreesboro would be the Battle of Stones River, also known as the Battle of Murfreesboro in the South, which was fought between December 31st, 1862 and January 2nd, 1863. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Civil War battles. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification. Be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.